Hello and welcome to Lesson 6 of Web Design and Development for Higher Computing Science. Last time we looked at float and clear. Today we're looking at margins and padding, and we'll take a very quick look at sizes as well. Last time we used float to make these section elements go side by side, so they're all floating to the left, and we also floated the images to the right so that the text can wrap around it. We used clear to reset the float so that this footer did not appear to the side of these elements, these sections. Today we're looking at margins and padding, and that's because this text is hard up against this image and there's no space. You can see it here as well. This word if is right up against that image, and these paragraphs or this text appears hard up against the image. There's no space between these sections and there's no space between the images and the paragraphs. To see this more clearly, I'll add a background color and I'll add some borders to the sections and the paragraphs. The background color itself doesn't matter, so I'll just set it to green. And you don't need to know about borders. It's not part of the course. So don't worry about adding your own borders. All you need to know is that this border, which is 1 pixel in width, it's black and it's solid, it's not dashed or dotted. This is going to help us visualize the margins and the padding. So if I refresh this, disgusting. But we can see how close to the edges these paragraphs really go. How much space there is. There's no space. You might be wondering, but hang on, the homepage has some space at the top, the homepage text. See this text? This heading has some space before and after it. And likewise, this paragraph has some space after it. Now that's because browsers, in this case I'm using Google Chrome, browsers come with some elements having built-in margins and padding. So headings, they have some built-in margins and padding before and after, like this. And it differs based on which browser you're using. Sometimes the SQA, in fact most times, when the SQA provides a CSS file, it will use the universal selector, which is the asterisk, and they will reset the margin to 0 and the padding to 0. And this universal selector selects every single element in the entire document, gives it a margin of 0, a padding of 0, but then when you add in some margins and padding, it resets it. It overwrites this first universal selector. Oops, I didn't even notice I had some stuff up there. There we are, that's better. So if I save this and refresh my page, you see all that extra space that headings come with is now gone. Same with the paragraphs, no space before and after. For this demonstration, I'm going to take out that resetting. I'm going to leave in the default margins and padding. And the reason is that you don't need to know about resetting using the universal selector, but I'm just telling you so that if you do see this in a coursework, where you're given a CSS file, that you understand it. But most browsers will by default have some space before and after headings and paragraphs. So you've kind of had a little preview as to what margins and paddings do, but what specifically do they do? If we go to the CSS box model page on the W3 Schools website, which I highly recommend by the way, we can see the box model here, and that is all about how much space or where the padding and the margin appears. So the content in this diagram, that could be your paragraph, your headings, it could be an image or any other HTML element. The content takes up its own space, and around the content, or between the content and the border, you've got padding. Then you've got the border, which in this case is a very thick, solid green border. But outside of the border, you've got this margin. Now on our example website, we have no margin around our sections, and we'll have no padding either. You can see that everything budges right up to the edge, and these sections are side by side, they're touching. So there's no margin around the border, and there's no padding inside the border. Likewise with this paragraph, although there is a little bit of margin outside it here and before it here, but that's the default. So to separate out these sections, we need to put a little bit of space between them. Now you can see that to put space between the borders, we need to use the margin. We need to add some margin. So let's do that to this section. All we do is we set a new margin and we give it some space. Margins can be rem, they can be em, or they can be pixels. 1 pixel is a little too small. I'm going to give it 10 pixels of space. If you're not sure about ems, rems, percentages, or points or pixels, you could definitely go to the W3 Schools and check out CSS units. It'll explain all the different units that you can use. So here we've got pixels. We also have measurements like centimeters, millimeters, points, picas, and all the other ones that you might have heard me speak about. Anyway, for this example, I'm using pixels. 10 pixels of margin on each section. Every section gets 10 pixels of margin. Let's check it. Boom! Now that's much nicer. Spaced out, looking good. One thing to note, see that space at the top here? You notice how that's pretty much half the size of this space between these two. And the space here at the bottom of this success section, that looks much smaller than the space between the success section and the study section. That's because there is only one margin at the bottom of this section, but there's a margin for the success section on the left of it, and there is a margin on the right of the study section. So this is technically two margins that we've got here side by side. So that's 20 pixels, even though it's only 10 pixels per margin, if that makes sense. So it's looking much better, but you can see that the text within each section is still bunched up. There's still no space between the heading and the border, and no space between the paragraph and the border. Well, if we want to add some space on the inside of this section, that would be padding. So let's add some padding. 10 pixels. Oh yes, looking even better. Now there's still one little thing that I think isn't perfect about this, and that's that the text, the paragraph, is still getting quite close to this image. It's not so bad on this homepage section, but this study section, that if gets real close. Now you might think, well, we could add some padding to the paragraph, or maybe some margin to the paragraph. Let's give it a try. Let's just take the same margins and padding that we used for the section. Whoops. We'll copy it and we'll add it to the paragraph. Let's save that. And refresh. And you'll see that we're still getting very close. We did add some padding and we did add some margin, so we do have more space, but we're still getting really close to this image. So margins and padding on the paragraph did not help the paragraph wrap around this image neatly. It still gets really close. So it's not the paragraph we need to set margins and padding to. What about the image? Let's try this. Save, refresh. There we go. Now it would appear that 10 pixels might be a bit too much, especially if we've got margins and padding. We maybe only need one of them. That's much better. Now we've got a bit of space all around it and it's not so bunched up. Of course, we are still bunched up on the left of this paragraph to the border, so maybe we do need a little bit of padding. Let's add padding back to the paragraph. Let's just do 6 pixels. Much nicer. So there you have a very quick introduction and explanation of margins and padding. I would always recommend going back to the W3 School's website to remind you of where padding and margins appear, but have a play about with it. Test it out and see what you can add margins and padding to and see if it improves the look of your website. Now the last thing I want to show you is width and height. We've already set the width of these sections to be 300 pixels. So these are all uniform in width, 300 pixels. But because they're uniform in width, but they have different amount of content, that means they don't have the same height. So let's just set a height. Now you may notice that if we set a height that's let's say 250 pixels, well, that's not going to be tall enough for some of these sections. Look at that. So the content of this section is spilling out of the height of the section. So we may want to choose a bigger height. Let's do that. Let's make it 350. That's much better. So that's height. You've already seen width. It's pretty straightforward. I'm sure you'll agree nothing complicated about that. And there we have lesson 6. All we've done is we've covered margins, padding, width, and height. With margins and padding, you can really make your websites look so much nicer, so much neater. You can give your website some space now, some room to breathe. Have an experiment with it, play about, and have some fun. I'll see you in the next one.